Why was there never a sequel to Need for Speed Most Wanted? The game received universal approval from players and critics. Its tongue-in-cheek gritty presentation has been parroted long after release. The police chases were unrivaled in sheer intensity, and commercially, it is Need for Speed Zenith, breaking the sales records of Underground at 16 million units sold. That's more than the 4 latest entries combined. The next generation came with it a new generation of Need for Speed. Thing is, Most Wanted did receive a direct follow-up, one which promised to combine the tuner culture and darkly lit streets of Underground with the exotic vehicles and police of Most Wanted, alongside crews, customization, and life or death duels on the canyon cliffs. And yet, this successor to the franchise's top-selling product received half the sales, beginning Black Box's journey from the developer that helped put this series on the map to remaining on the hard shoulder just 2 years later. Need for Speed Carbon is a game I was hyped for and yet have never played since, despite having distinct memories that I'll be sharing throughout. It's only fair to return to Palmont City to find out why. This has got to be one of the most repetitive questions I've read over the years in gaming communities, but shockingly, it was never raised by Electronic Arts. On first inspection, you could calculate from a business standpoint that Need for Speed had set a precedent for back-to-back releases within sub-brands. Underground was EA's previous best-selling game at 15 million units, but its sequel, released the very next year, sold less than half that. What's easy to forget, however, is the EA we know today wasn't the EA of January 2005 when Carbon started development. While referred to by some developers as the Borg and angering fans with the closing of studios like Westwood, Electronic Arts hadn't become notorious yet. If anything, they were turning a new leaf. From 2005 to 2011, EA invested heavily in a whole heap of original IP, distancing themselves from the reputation of licensed products, combining with their sports games. So while Need for Speed games were set to release on an annual basis, the developers retained full creative control. The team at Black Box prided themselves on striking the zeitgeist repeatedly, and you only do that through evolving the series. Underground exploded via the popularity of import tuner culture, and Most Wanted dominated through its exclusive pursuit gameplay that only GTA could match. But Most Wanted was also made in part because Undergrounds 1 and 2 both cut the police, and putting the core gameplay essentially on hold to develop the pursuits was required in order to bring that vision to life. Creative control by itself doesn't erase the challenges and constraints of harsh deadlines, all new platforms, large teams, and high ambitions. What you intend and what you create are often very different, and Carbon was no exception. What I've come to understand is this franchise's development cycle has such a vast collection of concepts, tones, and material that even for developers at ground zero, it's become a total blur. For instance, in 2008, a group within Black Box were illustrating Need for Speed Terror 5, where the creative goal reads, "How can large-scale street racing take place in a post-9/11 US city?" Yep. At one point, Need for Speed was conceptualizing a street racing game where your crew are labeled as terrorists. Unfortunately, we don't have such raw information on Need for Speed Repo Man, the game conceptualized alongside Most Wanted's pre-production mentioned in the previous Need for Speed Years Later video. All that exists are concept images done by Al Kang and one mention of the game's world, L5RA, in Most Wanted's PS2 demo. And this is where the confusion begins. In the concept art for Repo Man, there's a game called the Santiagos with tuner car marked in brackets. It sounds like Cruz in Carbon, an early draft of the Bushidos. But then you look at the concept art for Carbon, and it doesn't look like the game at all. In fact, it resembles Undercover. So what did Need for Speed Repo Man become? Did it turn into Need for Speed Carbon with its cruise in the canyons, or did it become Undercover with its high-speed highways? The answer is both. The Repo Man label in that Most Wanted demo file is most probably an oversight or placeholder, as the game officially started development as Need for Speed Carbon on January 3, 2005, scheduled for release in November 2006. This development cycle lines up with other games in the series. EA officially discussed their ecosystem with Need for Speed Pro Street, where they pulled 20 people from the Carbon team in 2006 to get started on Pro Street. That hints to the next piece of this puzzle. When people discuss EA Black Box, they're often referred to as a single studio, which they were, but with 3 teams, constantly shifting size in accordance to which games demanded priority. So at one point, Need for Speed Repo Man might have led to the concepts that would appear in Undercover, but under the name Carbon, before the team assigned to the project shifted their approach to the nighttime cities, crews, and canyons that the finished game is known for. I apologize for this initial headspin, but from here on out, we'll be discussing Need for Speed Carbon's development as the game you know, not Undercover, Pro Street, Terror 5, or Repo Man. Just Carbon. Now, while the Carbon team potentially shifted interests, they did not lower their ambitions. By this time, over 600 people were being credited in these games, and Most Wanted took an extra amount of effort pulling developers from the James Bond games to assist in pushing the game to Xbox 360. And remember, while Most Wanted innovated massively in its pursuit system and art style, little else was advanced, from customization to online functionality and core gameplay. For Carbon, they were creating an all-new open world, revamping customization, renewing drift mode, implementing crews, designing territories, importing a new category of vehicles, facilitating canyon races, adding new online modes, doubling the cutscenes using face capture, and developing for 2 next-generation gaming platforms. To say Black Box had their work cut out for them is a gross understatement. And remarkably, they pulled it off. Need for Speed Carbon was revealed at E3 2006, releasing gameplay and cinematic trailers together, and later detailing the game further in Game Informer's cover story. As a 12-year-old kid, I was legitimately hyped for this game. The idea of fighting for territory over cities with your car type of choice that settled on the most dangerous roads was very compelling. To the modern eye, it's easy to picture Shadow of War, but cars with this format. A dynamic sandbox that vary each time you play. And that might have been what the team dreamed up. There were multiple clans fighting for territory, not just the Big Four, hinted at with crews like Lee Samurai placing their markings throughout certain districts. All wingmen had Tier 1 and Tier 2 vehicles, whereas characters such as Nikki in the final game only had 1. Crews used to detail all 6 members with their age, height, car, and personality. But behind the scenes, developers were working round the clock to slim Carbon down into a shippable product. Multiple circuits, canyons, and story beats were changed or cleaved from the game entirely, presumably in the name of deadlines. But what that unfortunately meant was many of the game's ambitions needing to be reined in. Crews would be effectively fixed, with the big 3 representing each car class, and Stack Deck being a combination of them. While shooting multiple cutscenes where Nikki is portrayed explicitly as the protagonist's lost love, confirmed by the actress's interviews,
I play Nikki, who is essentially the player's girlfriend, and the player disappears or the hero disappears for about 5 years and comes back, and everybody's sort of pissed off, and especially me. I don't know, me just vanished out of nowhere.
Nearly all of these elements were edited out, including an ending that involved a race with Nikki, the final frame of this story being the 2 of you driving off into the distance, side by side. Drifting would return, but drag racing would be dropped, as did online play for last-generation consoles. But what wasn't cut content is this map, San Juan. Having sifted through heaps of theories, rumors, and concepts, I feel it's just as important to bust some myths about this game's development. There's concept art of Palmont City that exists before the game's name was even finalized that fits the released map almost exactly, right down to San Juan being isolated from the rest of the city. While there could have been more events conceived, it's within reason to say that this was designed to be the tutorial zone from day one. This concept map also puts a dent into the theory that the map itself was meant to be far bigger than conceived, or that the canyons would be part of the free roam environment. And finally, just because Black Box's plan at one point was to alternate between Pursuit and Tuner games, that doesn't mean Carbon's name was originally Underground 3. According to the people I've consulted, it's nothing more than a placeholder for an Xbox Live Rich Presence test. And as said, Pro Street lifted 20 people assigned to Carbon during development, meaning that original plan had long since been dropped. Black Box then had by all means done it again. They released another next-generation Need for Speed game, innovating its style, gameplay pillars, and feature set on all new platforms from scratch. With a sense of pride and relief, all that was left to be done was witness its reception on October 30th, 2006. As a child, I'd take a ferry every other weekend to meet up with my father who lived in the city, away from my home of Bowen Island. It was during one of those weekends that we went straight from the ferry terminal in Horseshoe Bay to EB Games at Park Royal. My dad normally making his way through the tedious traffic and cursing produced from it to see a smile on his son's face, knowing the game purchase would entertain me and possibly himself for the months to come. So when I beat the $70 PS2 Need for Speed Carbon Collector's Edition the very next day, you can guess his reaction. If there's one issue from Most Wanted that isn't repeated in Carbon, it's the game's overstretched campaign, but it feels less like an improvement and more tipping the scales from one end to the other. It's not 4 hours, but it is notably shorter than most games in the series, let alone its competition. However, I have a strong preference for 3-hour games I'd play 3 times than 30-hour games I'd play once, or even just a 3-hour game I'd play once and remember. The quality of those hours is what matters, and in Carbon's favor, the enjoyment starts right from the prologue. Reuniting with your M3 GTR, Cross's Corvette, and Most Wanted's green screen glory, just before hosting a first vehicle choice that's more intriguing than IS-300, Punto, or Cobalt. Progression is important, but Carbon understands that we're not here to start with Gran Turismo's snot boxes. Need for Speed should start fast, and Carbon does, but the improvements hardly stop there. Today, almost all arcade driving games involve Ridge Racer's style brake-to-drift mechanics, where navigating turns at ludicrous speeds is as simple as tapping the left trigger and letting the vehicle flow as effortlessly as water down a pipe. Need for Speed didn't do this prior to Criterion's Hot Pursuit. Their arcade flavor came from obscenely grippy cars, allowing one to maintain high speeds if chaining together the fastest lines of a circuit. That's the upside. The downside is that Underground and Most Wanted paired slow vehicles with this handling, making their initial hours a real slog. Hot Pursuit 2 controlled as it did to compensate for piloting Ferraris against 8 competitors and police units, not to drive an unmodified Punto on the freeway. Carbon strikes a balance. Its 3 starting vehicles would have appeared at the 3-hour mark previously, and their feel is more distinguished. Especially if you picked Muscle, the more varied handling model comes to play immediately. The Camaro slides, but not with elegance. Tapping the brake and steering with the expectation of flowing like water will only put you into the wall. It's honestly a bit of a pig, but that makes sense. It's a 60s Camaro. These shouldn't steer like the Mustangs and Monaros in Most Wanted, basically tuners that rumble. These should be about positioning yourself at all times to maximize the glorious and gutsy V8 engine during the straights, which in Carbon, it is. I'd be lying if this handling didn't cause moments of hair pulling. Oddly enough, it suffers the same issue as Assetto Corsa Competizione. Power slides endure for far too long with little or no ability to correct them. But that frustration is somewhat self-inflicted, as it's a trade-off for the fastest accelerating cars. And for those uninterested in the exchange, they can buy and/or spec a different car. This is the Need for Speed which began what's become a series staple, grip and drift builds. Performance upgrades are no longer just a linear progression in statistics, they come with decisions that you feel directly while playing, and it does wonders to keep the game engaging, as every vehicle is notably different and so too are every player's modifications. A cynic would correctly point out this is just vehicle tuning, something that is itself a standard in driving games. But not only is it more of a rarity in arcade titles, I'd be willing to bet most players don't engage with these settings. When viewing a menu like this, I only assume I'm going to make everything worse by messing with settings, and stick with the defaults, or when allowed, hijack other people's setups. However, attaching simpler values to the parts you purchase is an ingenious way to make players think about what car they're actually building, and because you're seeing these values one at a time, you don't feel overwhelmed or intimidated. It's something that I'm glad has managed to stick around after all these years in the Need for Speed series. It dawned on me how many of Heat's best components planted their seeds here. It emulates Underground 2's goal of expanding customization beyond how cars looked and went, but how cars felt. This was likely also done because racing has a much bigger emphasis than previously. I know, a racing game where the primary mode is racing, real hard-hitting analysis, but that actually hadn't been Need for Speed's major selling point in the last two entries. Those were given to the open world and cop chases. So in a game where both of those are expectations rather than innovations, it made Black Box refine the core gameplay. Rubber band AI will always exist to a degree, but it's far less egregious here than in Most Wanted. I wasn't being overtaken by Audi A3s in Lamborghinis. Shortcuts don't appear on your minimap as in Most Wanted, being more akin to Hot Pursuit 2 and in a good way. Those shortcuts become something you're actively thinking of and deciding upon, rather than your eyes defaulting to whichever pathway is the shortest on the lower third. What has been retained from Most Wanted is the sense of speed. You're not crazy for thinking the speed itself is slower than that game. It's been confirmed by various people I've spoken to, but it's not without reason. I've said Need for Speed's especially enjoyable at 120 to 140 miles an hour through tight urban streets, and coincidentally or intentionally, Carbon's optimized for this speed. Palmont is littered with sharp turns, steep inclines, shortcuts, and varying widths of the road. To maintain Most Wanted speed with more varied handling in more varied streets with more competitors is even conceptually too chaotic. That style's best left to Midnight Club. So the options were to slow the game down a hair or make the courses less complex, and considering this game's selling point, I'm glad they chose the former. Canyon racing was in during this era. Even Fast and Furious depicted it that very same year. Only this game was able to build an even bigger, more fantastical tribute to it. It acknowledges the roots in Japanese toge racing via its score, while mapping out American hills this form of competition had expanded to. It's easy to throw on Initial D's Eurobeat and view this as an unofficial entry in the Demerol series, but I think Carbon's tone make it a lot more exciting in the moment. Canyon races aren't treated with fluff, but life or death battles where you're eyeballing the enemy and the environment. Unlike almost all other forms of racing in this game, canyon duels aren't about crossing the line in first, but maintaining and setting the pace. 2 rounds are spent dividing these goals between the contestants. You follow and are followed, with a meter constantly scoring both performances. You stick close enough to your opponent to accumulate enough points for withstanding their own attack. Both rounds are a unique form of pressure. The meter scoring every millisecond made even more pronounced by the banning of nitrous, disallowing any fast recoveries from mistakes. These roads are packed with steep inclines, blind corners, undulations, tight bends, and most importantly, weak guardrails that, should you go through, result in an instant loss, requiring both rounds to be done from the start. Canyon races were to Carbon what police chases were to Most Wanted, and what's humbling is how much of a spectacle this mode is to play, despite being so much less of one by comparison on the surface. But it succeeds for the same reason Pursuits did in Most Wanted. It's where everything in the game comes together. There's the game mode itself, holding everything you do under a microscope. There's the handling, allowing you to take chances where you couldn't in a more realistic game. There's sound design, pushing the engine wars, tire screeches, and collisions that bit beyond reality without being obnoxious. And then there's the aforementioned score. When you're on the verge of losing it, keeping your pedal to the floor as the guardrails get closer and closer, with these music stings blaring at their highest, Carbon is in a class of its own. Even to this day, because nothing's aimed to replicate the Canyon duels since. Its closest analogs are showdowns in the Run or events in Horizon, the former emphasizing visual spectacle rather than gameplay, and the latter being enjoyable but elaborate time trials. Carbon's duels aren't completely authentic. Opponents, while I don't believe to be scripted, are immune to collisions, leading to occasions where they're driving into you and building speed. It's obviously done to prevent you from cheesing the duels by pushing them over the edge, as this trait carries over to multiplayer. But those occasions don't feel any less fair in the moment. But that's not the reason these duels have been abandoned despite being Carbon's most memorable gameplay. I might have compared Canyons to Pursuits, how both form their game's respective strengths into a harmonious whole. But there's a major distinction. The majority of time in Most Wanted was spent in Pursuits. Carbon's duels amount to 4 events in total. You do revisit these canyons in both race and drift events, but not only do they appear with seemingly no rhyme or reason, clicking icons in the city that teleport you to the hills, they're also far less exciting, because races don't feature any weakened guardrails, and drifting is, well, do you remember Need for Speed Nitro? Another memory of this game that stands out is how much I hated these drift events as a kid. I liked drifting in Underground and was excited to hear of their return, but I had no understanding of game engines or physics systems back then. So it confused 12-year-old me as to why it felt like drift events came from an entirely different game. Now I understand that it effectively is. The driving model used for drifting is completely overhauled from the main game with its own set of physics, acceleration, and steering that truly does feel like a precursor of what was to come. Because these physics are insane. You're drifting in 6 gear. It's here where the initial D comparisons are unavoidable. I hated it back then, but I must admit, replaying it now, this mode would have been its own bundle of fun if it weren't for one thorn in its side: the difficulty. All of your opponents are Glass Joe. You don't even need to drift in drift mode because the scores are so pathetic you'll obtain enough points even when taking corners quickly rather than stylishly. And adding to the point of this game's best content being a rarity, you spend more time drifting than dueling. That means the bulk of success relies upon racing, pursuits, in the open world. Carbon's races are more in-depth and enjoyable than Most Wanted's, thanks to the improvements made in vehicle tuning, rubber banding AI, and shortcuts. But that doesn't mean it's flawless, and unfortunately one of the problems stems from a new feature: wingmen. Considering the attention Most Wanted gained for its over-the-top characters and cutscenes, it's not surprising the developers wanted interactions beyond text messages. That's where wingmen stand in. Not only are these characters involved in the main storyline, they assist in gameplay via 3 types: blockers, drafters, and scouts. Each do what you'd expect from their names: hold up competitors, grant speed boosts, and find shortcuts. It's a great concept. But unfortunately, the end result leaves a lot to be desired. For one thing, the rubber banding from previous games still exists. It's merely inherited by your companions than competitors. Scouts most egregiously. Because they must lead you to shortcuts, they're always tasked with being in front no matter how perfectly you're driving, even when you're not ordering them to. The game is not subtle about it. And while it's sensible for races your wingman wins to count towards progress, as you're meant to be a team, it drains excitement from the races. The extra opponents on screen, more challenging handling, and AI improvements are all wasted when you're in second place, doubly assured in events in the bag with your wingman leading, as even if the AI's car were to explode, you just take their place. The abilities themselves aren't that inspired either. I don't hold much against the developers in this regard, being that there's not much you could do within a series that has some grounding in reality. Dropping spike strips or firing EMPs would be crossing the line in this game, as not even the police do such a thing. We'll get to it. Blockers are more accurately torpedoes, and drafters have their fun building speed, but sadly the game so rarely utilizes its highway network during races, their benefits often can't be used to the fullest, and they lead to the same rubber banding issues of scouts. What could have made this gameplay more interesting overall is if rival clans also worked together with their wingmen using the same abilities, but that's never done. In fairness, the blockers would have to go in that scenario. I mean, imagine coming around the final corner in first place only to get... You know when riders unintentionally force themselves into a corner they can't escape without sacrificing one of their figurative limbs? The same thing can happen in game design, and Carbon's a prime example. The game's premise is building a crew to take over other crews until you're king of the hill. It wouldn't make sense to race by yourself as a crew, hence the wingmen. But the wingmen at best repeat lines of dialogue throughout the campaign, and at worst make the racing legitimately less exciting. But you have to keep them, because if you don't, every single player will make mention of how silly it is to be a crew of one person, even if doing so would ultimately make the gameplay more enjoyable. There is one area where you are alone, however, the open world. Unfortunately, it's only for a couple seconds at a time, because unlike Most Wanted and Underground 2, there's absolutely no reason to engage in it. This actually isn't surprising, because within just 2 games, the series eased off its presence of the initial hype of Underground 2. As it turns out, driving from shop to shop separated by multiple miles of road you've seen dozens of times in and outside of races isn't much fun, and Most Wanted understood that, hence being able to jump to events and challenges. But at least that game's open world came alive in the chases, allowing you to do things that just weren't possible in Hot Pursuit. Carbon, however, has no crew or territory challenges connected to bounties, so getting into pursuit chases only gives external rewards beyond the story, and it highlights how much of a pushover cops are in the initial phases, especially when bonuses multiple crewmates give relate to lowering the presence of the police. Of all the pursuits in my career for this video, not one of them lasted beyond a single heat. Now, you could do this in Most Wanted as well, but you'd be preventing progress in the career mode. Without that incentive, there's no reason to ignore fast traveling to events, which is probably why the game's runtime is so brief. Carbon has about the level of content of previous games. I know it definitely has more than Underground 1. That game repeats one layout 5 times in its opening hour alone. But unlike the last 2 entries, there isn't a component to pad that runtime. Customization is the place where hours could be lost to building vehicles, customizing parts, and creating liveries to make something stand out. There was an innovation for customization in Carbon, Autosculpt. Rather than doubling down on aftermarket parts, which EA presumably needs to negotiate licensing fees with, Blackbox's solution was to put custom parts in the hands of players, unlocking multiple blueprints that players could adjust components of to make hood, roof scoop, or spoilers completely their own. Similar to Wingmen, it's a brilliant idea, but it unfortunately only presents itself to the most persistent players, ones who will bother to unlock everything, fiddle with multiple sliders over 6 parts that are quite slow, and ignore body kits which accomplish the same job in fewer clicks. Carbon wasn't willing to push people towards its innovations like its predecessors did. People complained about the star ratings in Underground 1, but it ultimately existed to make people use the customization system that no other racing game offered at the time. People remember Underground's customization. They remember Underground 2's open world. They remember Most Wanted's police chases. Very few remember Autosculpt, or Wingmen, or Canyons, because they're present, but not often enough to be distinct. Building a slimmer yet more flexible experience could have been a good thing if the core gameplay itself was firing on all cylinders, but it doesn't. At least, not for most of that time. But the ultimate irony is this: Most Wanted shelved its racing, customization, and AI to overhaul its pursuits, In the very next game, it's so filled with new mechanics, the police pursuits are lifted entirely from Most Wanted, right down to radio chatter, AI, vehicles, and Paul Linford's score that has absolutely no business in a neon nighttime metropolis based off of California's major cities. There's not even any helicopters, most likely because it wouldn't be mapped to Palmont's layout. Without top quality races, pursuits, or open world design, that leaves one avenue for Carbon to excel in: story. As minor as Most Wanted's story was, it left a massive impression, becoming part of the game's iconography, imitated and parodied for years afterward. So it only makes sense Black Box invested more into its sequel with bigger stars and longer cutscenes that build to a greater plotline. I mentioned Carbon starts brilliantly, and your reunion with Cross is part of that.
Sit down! How you been? It's time to settle a little score from Rockport, you think?
The acting is gloriously over the top, and everything reinforces it. The dark comic book lighting, cheesy dialogue, and music all fit within Need for Speed's now established camp. What quickly becomes apparent, however, is there's something less fun about the presentation, and I think it can be quickly explained with this. This introduction is so charming. It's a guy who thinks he's so goddamn cool, yet looks like a complete idiot. And as it turns out, that was the point.
Remember the band? There was a song out at the time, and it was about a guy trying to be cool, so he got like a tattoo, but he got a tattoo of 31 instead of 13. And when I went out for the audition, that's what I put in. So all my gestures and everything were just like trying to...
That, I think, is part of the magic. Ronnie wasn't intended to be the way he is, but he's better for it. The plot and the places Most Wanted went were completely bog standard, but the presentation was unlike anything games had seen at the time. Part of that was the technology, but it was also the acting. Carbon carries that first torch, but not the second. Wolf, Kenji, and Angie are not Ronnie or Razor. They're completely forgettable antagonists, in large part due to them being almost indistinguishable in their interactions. They might have in-depth bios, concept art, and costume work, but all have the same encounters before dueling on the canyons and whimpering one pathetic line before never being heard again. They technically appear once more with Stacked Deck, but I suspect it wasn't originally planned because they don't offer any new lines or cutscenes. When Ronnie pulls up, I laugh. When any of these three pull up, I roll my eyes.
I don't know what's more pathetic, your crew or your car.
The lines aren't funny, quippy, or memorable. They're just lame. And it makes me wonder how Most Wanted would have been had it followed the original direction as closely as Carbon seemingly has. Though that is potentially unfair, because as mentioned, the cutting room floor is thick with material, much of which could have given this game's story more energy. Cross in Carbon doesn't match his best scenes in Most Wanted because he's sidelined almost immediately. But originally in that opening scene, he pulled a move, an ante-up on keying your car last time.
Oh! Whoa! My bad, Romeo.
I understand why it's cut. The scene does move more efficiently without it. But that hints to a greater problem. The story penned here requires more characters and exposition, but it doesn't leave room for those scene-chewing moments. Interestingly, the closest we get is Elias Tufexis, Adam Jensen himself, in his first video game role, as someone you wouldn't at all expect him to play today.
May I introduce Sal Mostella?
Hi. Nikki said that you might be looking for a new wingman. You don't know me, but well, I know you. I'm a big fan. I've seen all your races.
And on that note, I'll be out of here.
Just like Cross's one good scene though, this is the only moment we get of Sal. The cast is actually quite extensive, with multiple characters capable of carrying what Saul demonstrates, but they're wasted on developing the game's main plot, a paint-by-numbers whodunit. It's not all bad, and like Colorshed Productions said, there's one aspect I'll give full credit for. The game's story takes place before and after Most Wanted, yet you don't need to have played that game to understand what's going on. That's an impressively rare trait for a direct follow-up, though perhaps its possibility is due to the events of both games being so limited. Prior to Rockport, the hero character was involved in a Palmont street race interrupted by a police ambush. You were given what was thought to be the prize money, but there's nothing in it, and you're forced to bail the city with only a car. It turns out you were let go on purpose. The police avoided your car, opened an exit, and swapped the bags. Who would have the motivation and established power to do such a thing? Darius. Yeah, it's Darius. It's not upsetting the villain is spotted from a mile away. The actor even claimed to deliberately seeking out villain roles after playing the goody two-shoes on most television shows. He's having fun with it. What's upsetting is how much time is devoted to explaining the plot, rather than endearing us to any of the characters. The Wingman's introductions are also placed very poorly in the campaign. After Neville and Soul, each crew member is taken from another gang, met after you defeat their boss. By force, actually, the game won't let you do anything after a boss fight until you've met them. However, you never see them prior to this, so when they're speaking like you've known them since the game's flashback, it's hard to relate.
I can help you guys out. I'm one of the best drivers in this city and you know it.
Who the fuck are you?
The most notably wasted character, however, is Nikki. Imagine cleaving Alex Vance in Half-Life 2, Anna in Metro Exodus, or these two in Cyberpunk, and you've got the gist of what happened here. Whether the game was written or performed well enough to convincingly portray a love interest, that's a separate topic. Few had even attempted the concept in a mainstream game by 2006. But Carbon tried. There's multiple deleted scenes of Nikki growing from a heartbroken ex to the hero's partner in crime, even going as far as concluding the game with the two of you racing. The cut content goes beyond just cleaving a character's entire storyline, but changing Carbon's conclusion itself. That deleted scene is why the game's ending doesn't feel like an ending at all. Darius just drives off. No final race or chase like before, just a fade to black, where it was originally supposed to cut to Nikki, obviously nervous from a controlling ex leaving, to proposing a final drive with warmth. Characters are often defined not by their normal behavior, but their atypical actions. Tally gets drunk on your ship, once. Varric cries in your arms, once. Panam screams at her leader, once. Yet, they're part of why people care about them so much. These are the moments that stand out in people's memories. If Nikki had lines about her connection to the player that generated some empathy, any amount of it, while minor in duration, it's massive in impact, and the end result is someone who's left to be another cart on the exposition train, rather than someone who could have been unique, not just in Need for Speed, but gaming in general. The story of Carbon isn't awful, but it is objectively more invasive, taking up more screen time within a shorter game without the entertainment to justify it. It's been said by Electronic Arts that while the HD generation of gaming had started with the Xbox 360, Most Wanted and Carbon were both developed for the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube first, then updated and upscaled to 7th gen consoles. Pro Street was the first time this process would be reversed. By Undercover, the 6th generation was all but abandoned by Black Box and left to outsource studios to complete, even extending to the Nintendo Wii. As per usual, what you've been seeing for the most part is the PC version, though without any mods to assist beyond widescreen support. I tried texture mods, but couldn't get them to perform reliably. Not that the game desperately needs it. Carbon, like Most Wanted before it, still looks impressive, particularly when it's built for 6th generation consoles. It lets down in one regard though. Playing Underground 2 for this video, I couldn't understand why it seemed more visually pleasing until I realized what it lacked. Filters. Carbon didn't always have its purple-blue tint. The E3 footage looks notably cleaner without it, and while my monkey brain immediately distinguishes it from Most Wanted's brown, my monkey brain also prefers variety in color. So despite its character models and scenery being far more detailed, I find Underground 2 to be more visually appealing. It might also contribute to Palmont not being the most memorable of Need for Speed's open worlds, though it is populated with beautiful architecture and distinct zones that are uniquely fun to navigate, rather than just look at. Racing Darius through a Las Vegas-inspired strip before taking it to the canyons with music more reminiscent of Ghost of Tsushima is eclectic, yet seamless. And speaking of music, this game's score is seriously underrated. Paul Linford's pursuit music in Most Wanted was dynamic, flipping through a variety of tracks to fit whatever the player was doing. Carbon brought this to the races. Trevor Morris is at the helm, and there's seemingly nothing he left off the table. Horns, synths, drums, tambourines, and guitars, it's all here. There's another fascinating component. The score is led by Trevor, but it's combined with Ekstrak. I always wondered where Mass Effect 3's Purgatory music came from in Carbon, and it's not in menus, but the races. They brilliantly serve to give these events levity. Trevor's epic anthems aren't dominating the soundscape to Carbon's detriment. It's an expertly crafted score, and deserves both more credit and attention, hence why I devoted the time here. And it's something every console and PC retains, though in terms of PC ports, it's not the best. Settings often default to the lowest textures, map controls will change axes of my controller, and there's some visual bugs. It's also lacking the enhanced graphical effects that are exclusive to the PS3 version. Happily, there's no framerate restrictions, performance issues, or lacking feature sets, meaning it also included the multiplayer that didn't appear on Xbox, PS2, and Wii. While it's not a lavish experience, the multiplayer finally included some unique modes, ones you get the suspicion were intended for Most Wanted. They're Pursuit Tag and Knockout. The former is what you'd expect. An open-ended map with one player escaping from everybody else designated as a cop. The latter is also what you'd expect. Knockout racing, only the last place driver of each lap becomes an officer. The chaos of 7 cops chasing one player is just fun to watch. So multiplayer absolutely contained value for the overall package. You can still play it today. Lobbies are available on PS3, and there's a Discord server for PC, though there's a tedious part of the process. This game came out long before Origin, so the accounts required for online access are strictly old ones created when Carbon was relevant. You can't make a new identity, meaning there's a limited number of accounts that exist. It's possible to play, but you might log someone out, and vice versa.
This thing fucking drifts!
Oh, come on, I didn't alt-tab!
Someone logged in.
Yeah, that's probably what happened. For those unwilling to go back to 30 frames per second, the PC version is a solid way to relive your Carbon experiences. But for those who aren't 60 FPS or bust, the PS3, Xbox 360, and even 6th gen versions are all enjoyable. The PS3 port could be considered the definitive version of this game thanks to its graphics. It was also advertised to feature 6-axis motion support where tilting the controller sideways would give your steering an extra push. Having tested it myself, I felt nothing. There's no options for it in the menus, no mention of it on the box or the manual, nothing. Strange considering IGN were talking about it in their PS3 Impressions article, released just 2 weeks prior to launch. Either way, the game controls just fine without it, and the lack of 6-axis gimmicks in a PS3 launch title is actually quite refreshing. The other next-generation console, however, has lots more in common with its last-gen counterparts with one obvious exception. Now, I do own a Wii, but it's in boxes downstairs and I don't have the space for it on my already cluttered TV. So we'll be emulating Carbon over Dolphin and experiencing the motion controls via a third-party sensor. I'd love to use exclusively my footage, but it for some reason looks like this. So, YouTube it is. What's shocking is how effective the controls actually are. They far exceeded my expectations. Whether you're using the Wii Remote itself or one of the many nunchuck configurations, little is sacrificed on the Wii in gameplay terms. Drifting is where I had trouble with the tilt controls, but with the remote controlling the acceleration and brake, and the nunchuck's analog stick steering, it was easy, and felt totally natural. Other than that, it's effectively the same game as the GameCube version, which aside from minor differences, is like the PS2 and Xbox versions. Now, Carbon doesn't have the clarity of older Xbox racing games. Things like Rally Sport Challenge or Project Gotham Racing hold up surprisingly well, and lots of that has to do with the smoothness and purity of the image. Carbon, meanwhile, has so much motion blur and distortion at this low of a resolution output, it's like swallowing edibles with whiskey. The motion blur is apparent on PC and next gen as well, but it's much easier to see where you're going with a high resolution image. Aside from the varying fidelity and control methods, however, the game itself is the same on all 6 platforms. Missing grid girls or civilian vehicles aside, what's really different are the handhelds, and a console no one's ever heard of. Need for Speed Carbon Own the City is Carbon's equivalent of Most Wanted 510 or Underground Rivals, a game developed from the ground up for the PSP meant to capture the spirit and essence of its console counterparts with its own team and takes on designs, story, and gameplay. 510 was horrendous. It was a game cobbled together out of complete desperation, being scheduled to release alongside its console counterpart despite already releasing a Need for Speed game for PSP that year. Thankfully, Team Fusion were given more time for Own the City, enough to allow them a serious reimagining of Carbon with its own story, characters, crews, wingmen, and open world. That last part was something the team were especially proud of. As this is a reimagining though, Carbon's terrific opening doesn't carry over. Own the City's introduction is awful, forcing you on the same stretch of highway 3 times to showcase the different abilities your wingmen have. 2 of them are more extreme versions of the console versions, and one of them is from Criterion's Hot Pursuit, dropping spike strips. Brawlers are blockers with anger management issues, full-blown murdering somebody else's car. Drafters are the same, only their cone of speed is even more overt, and fully controls your steering, as some have found out, even when they're going backwards. Canyon races don't exist, and the open world is actually more like Rockport than Palmont. The blue filter did not translate, but thankfully the sense of speed and solid driving model from Underground Rivals did. Poor introduction aside, the pacing is actually decent. You get more interesting circuits much earlier than Most Wanted's seemingly endless highways, and there's better variety within events. Rather than the takedown mode being isolated, it's now played in the main career mode. It still doesn't match the various modes of Rivals, but it is an improvement from before. There's also Escape, which is basically Marked Man from Burnout Paradise, and Delivery, races of following the arrow rather than a closed circuit. I can't say Own the City for PSP is a bad time. All in all, it's a perfectly functional and rather effortless experience, especially with a 60 FPS hack on an emulator, which is what you've been witnessing. However, there are 2 very notable things about this game. The first, its statistics are astoundingly stupid. A Lotus Elise does not handle worse than a Ford Mustang. Top Gear could have told you that. The second is its story and its twist. In this game's original story, you're racing your brother Mick when all of a sudden, both of you crash. After 6 months in hospital and developing amnesia, you wake up to Mick's girlfriend Sarah, who explains he was killed in the crash. It's theorized that he was murdered, and it's your goal to get to the bottom of who did it, starting with finding the driver who rammed him during that race. After conquering enough territory, you get a lead on someone named Buddy, a lead that's confirmed by someone else named EX, and an explosion happens outside. It's supposed to hint that Sarah was killed in the explosion, but it's not communicated clearly, and not helped by a completely unrelated race starting immediately after it happens. The cutscenes have no connection to the gameplay. You're purely playing the game to unlock animated comic panels. Later on, you find Buddy, who says he was ordered by EX to kill your brother, and you submit that evidence to someone else named MK, who's actually an undercover cop, and gets EX arrested. Justice has been dealt. But hold on, Sarah arrives to give a plot twist. EX set up Buddy to kill Mick because you ordered EX to do it.
No, John. You are the demons.
Turns out Mick was actually a raging piece of shit to you and Sarah, so you plotted to kill him. This is an E10 rated Need for Speed game about street racing where you unironically play as a murderer, and the game concludes with you hugging Sarah against the sunset with triumphant music. What the? Own the City is one of the most bizarre games I've ever witnessed for this reason alone. It's made doubly bizarre by how conservative the rest of the game is. It's a competent and enjoyable, if slightly underwhelming, racer for the PSP that contains one of the most tone-deaf conclusions to a video game. The twist itself isn't the head-scratcher, it's one that's been done for decades. What kills me is how this game seems completely unaware of how messed up Sarah and your character actually are. Yet it hints that because you're a better person after getting amnesia in the wreck, that it's fine! And you deserve Mick's watch because you're a better person even though he was an asshole and you're a murderer! I'll be honest, my motivation for exploring these other versions of the game became, are you also a murderer? Are you a murderer on the Game Boy Advance? Yes. Yes, you are. Own the City wasn't merely a PSP game, it stood in for all the handheld editions of it. Despite that, the versions still play very different to one another, though in the GBA's case, it's almost exactly the same as the system's previous games. Because Own the City bothered with a story mode, there's now brief stills summarizing the voice-acted panels of its PSP counterpart. But other than that, its graphics, driving, and customization is all like Most Wanted, which is not an awful experience, it's just outshined by far better games on the system, and are legitimately enjoyable in their own right. Frankly, this is the real question. Is the DS version just as bad as Most Wanted? It's good. Like, properly good. What's going on here? As it turns out, rich development history is a thing, even when it comes to handheld ports of real games. Most Wanted DS was developed by Sensory Sweep Studios. Sounds like one of my awful video titles. A handheld developer that attempted to break into the Xbox Live Arcade market before filing for bankruptcy. However, it only made 2 games under EA, Tiger Woods 05 and Need for Speed Most Wanted for the DS. In other words, this studio's output was so awful even EA couldn't stand to retain them. Own the City for DS was instead done by Exient Entertainment, who would help EA with handheld, mobile, last-gen, and Wii console ports until 2010. And when it comes to core gameplay, Exient Entertainment evidently, had talent. The effort they put into this isn't just evident via gameplay, it comes through in the customization options, where the surprisingly good-looking dashboard integrating all of the UI elements can be altered. Now, I shouldn't get carried away. The rubber banding AI is appalling at times, layouts start to repeat themselves even in the early hours, and the campaign's just as ridiculous as its PSP counterpart. Even the handful of cut-down songs really started to wear thin in my playtime. But I can't say it's a bad game. If I had this on my DS as a kid, I wouldn't feel gypped in the slightest. No, that emotion's reserved for people who could only play Need for Speed Carbon on the Zeebo. The Zeebo was an online-based console released exclusively in Mexico and Brazil that managed to convince Activision, Capcom, Namco, Disney, id Software, and yes, EA to release games for. Being that EA released games for the Gizmondo just a year prior, however, it's not surprising the company wanted to scrape any market feasible. For Need for Speed, its system debut is a butchered version of Own the City on PSP. Cutscenes have no voice acting, frame rate's miserable, and the graphics themselves had to be downgraded from Sony's handheld. I'm not LGR or AVGN, so I'm not going to hunt down a physical system myself, but for those whose only option for Need for Speed Carbon was on the Zeebo, I kinda feel for them. Though it could be worse. They could have had 510 instead. mods. I love them, you love them, everybody loves them. And judging from the mods being created for games that are 20 years old, the Need for Speed community loves them too. Sadly, most games don't have the proper tools for modders to really go crazy. There's no equivalents of Counter-Strike, DayZ, or Galactic Warfare here. But there's options for Carbon. Cut content, beta mods, updated visuals, texture packs, vehicles, but what really caught my attention was a career mode overhaul called Battle Royale. It's not what you're thinking, trust me. Developed by Max Carbon Battle Royale is a wombo combo of previous mods assembled into one convenient package. With it, you get new map zones, new challenge series events, 100 plus new races, new event types like city drifts and canyon speed traps, dozens of new vehicles, increased difficulty across the board, and what caught my interest, a new story and structure. That final addition's apparent from the beginning, where you don't watch the prologue race, you play it. Just like the prologue in Most Wanted. This is awesome. Immediately, I already felt more connected to the inciting incident just by the virtue of controlling Darius's borrowed Supra personally. It leads to the same predicament, but rather than disappear for 5 years, you only run to Rockport for 1 day. And coming back, you stay out of Palmont and stay in San Juan, building your new crew, reputation, and vehicle collection there as you witness the map get conquered by the Big Four dynamically. This is so much more like what people imagined for Carbon. A territory map that's influenced to go a certain way, but not fixed. You even witness one of the major gangs lose territory to someone smaller and need to fight for it back. But the overhauls don't end with the story and map, it further applies to vehicles and events. Rather than tuner, muscle, and exotics, classes are boost, race, and drift. Within these classes, vehicles have been made even more pronounced. You can do speed traps with a race car rather than boost car, but lacking top speed and quick acceleration is a serious disadvantage, as is bringing a boost car with inferior handling to city street races. More importantly, this means your garage is diverse from the beginning. In Carbon, the 3 vehicle types were more about preferences rather than pushing you towards particular styles of gameplay. Here, you need a drift build to win these events. This leads to the other component. While Carbon races weren't the cakewalk they were in prior games, they were still pretty easy overall. So when looking for something different when installing this mod, of the 3 difficulty options, I picked the hardest. But be advised, if you do this, you better be awake. There are races with certain cars and specs you simply cannot win. You'll be exiting to the menu multiple times to find another race that's beatable or one that unlocks parts you need to upgrade for those more challenging events. But this absolutely comes with positive effects. For one thing, the high scores of opponents in drifting forces you to engage in the unique drifting engine. And goddamn, when you chain events at speeds to make ridge racers squirm, it's a total rush. As are the races where wingmen truthfully win you races, and you feel naked and vulnerable without their support in others. Your vehicles are encouraged to be highly specialized in one field rather than being jack of all trades, assuring you maximize the game's mechanical depth. And the sheer number of new races is a total breath of fresh air. There are routes and roads I never experienced before, despite being very familiar with Palmont's layout. The original game simply didn't squeeze every inch of road. And things like canyon speed traps or city drift events are welcome additions that add all new challenges to the game you wouldn't expect. Bringing muscle cars to these winding bends to maximize their speed in the briefest of sprints is exciting, and charging intersections sideways is a different rush compared to the enclosed drifting circuits. This mod is quite the marvel for a 120 megabyte file that mostly tweaks what already existed and just needed to be repackaged. For big fans of Carbon who are looking to experience it in an all-new way, this mod should absolutely be considered. But I wouldn't go so far as to recommend it over the original. For as much as I love a good challenge, especially in events that were previously pathetic, Battle Royale is uneven to the point of frustration. There's times where you'll chain together impossible races back to back, desperately trying to identify the one that puts down the whip and grants a proper challenge. It's not helped by the fact that rubber banding, which Carbon originally improved, has come back with an absolute vengeance. Now, in fairness, this is the hardest difficulty, so if this was the only issue with Battle Royale, the solution would simply be to lower it. The less challenge wouldn't remedy being unable to swap cars without going to the Safehouse, when the career now all but requires jumping from ride to ride constantly. These faults aren't so much to do with the designers, but limitations of the mod itself. There's only so much those designers can do. They can open up San Juan, but they can't resolve its texture pop-in, or lack of connection to the city. There's also something that, depending on who you're talking to, is a good or bad thing. Because you're battling more territory over more events in more game modes, the career is much longer than before. For those massively disappointed by Carbon's brevity, that sounds like a relief. But it's obvious the original game wasn't meant to have duels so spaced out, nor were wingmen supposed to repeat their lines for so long. Battle Royale is fresher, yet rougher. It's why I wouldn't recommend it to those who have never experienced the core game, or just play the series casually. But for those who have got that Need for Speed itch, revisiting one or multiple entries routinely, this mod might be exactly what you're looking for. It's challenging, it's refreshing, and most importantly, it's complete. There's not much more in terms of content you could ask for here. This mod is immensely impressive, and all of its contributors should be proud of themselves. If you'd like to download the mod yourself, links are in the description. My memory of Carbon has endured for 15 years, and it wasn't exactly positive. The game wasn't bad, but it was hard not to feel a little let down by its brevity or lack of meaningful innovations compared to the previous leaps. However, playing so much of this game for the past 2 months, I've come to greatly appreciate it, far more than I ever did, because I never stopped to think of why I finished the game in 2 sittings. The game was quicker, sure, but there's plenty of 10-hour games I've not put 1 hour into, racers very much included. This genre is one of the most fundamentally repetitive out there. It's almost inescapable, as part of its enjoyment is the mastery that comes from its repetition. Yet Carbon managed to maintain such a balance, such an unobtrusive experience, that I couldn't stop playing until there was nothing more to play. Very few games can pull that off. Carbon did, and much of that enjoyment is still there today. Maybe the issue with Carbon is that it was too smooth for its own good. That there existed so few highs that were so brief, players couldn't carry an hour of significance with them after turning the game off. There was too little to remember. It's often speculated that Carbon originally intended to take its concepts much further. Shadow of Mordor with cars, fully dynamic map, playable openings, but that's just speculation. There's never been any confirmation Black Box were dreaming so big. And part of the tragedy is, even if they were, it would never happen. Restrictions often ensure creativity, but it doesn't stop people from dreaming big. And when a game like Carbon packs so many vast concepts into one package, it's hard not to imagine what Black Box could have done with a blank check. Instead of another solid entry the next year, Most Wanted success could have been the excuse to take a year off and build anticipation for the ultimate entry that doesn't skip on anything and excels at everything. But saying that out loud, it even sounds fantastical. There would be no benefit for EA's business to do this. While Carbon sold less than half of Most Wanted, it was still one of the best-selling games of 2006. It did its job. It didn't need to do anything more. And as for Black Box, they're not infallible. Taking that year off to create a supposed masterpiece could have easily failed, and put them on the sidelines even faster than the decline from Most Wanted to Undercover did. It's even likely the goal of capturing the essence of car and street racing culture every year is what inspired things like canyon races in the first place. As you can tell, I've been conflicted with what this game is and what it could have been. What I've grown to accept, however, is what it could have been would have never happened, making me grateful for what it is. Can you buy me some GME and AMC? Well, this Q&A isn't going to age well. Why am I dumb? Have you seen your memes? Have you tried Opera? Yes. Chrome is better. If this doesn't make the next video, I'm unsubbing.
That's not a question.
No.
Will you ever play Phasmophobia with Kalasag? Why haven't you played Phasmophobia with Kalasag? Does you do nothing with Kalasag? Why do you only watch bad anime? Because I'm an uncultured normie. I truly do aspire to your weedness. Wait, do serious questions get answered on these? They do. Let's use the following question as an example. Do fish know when it's raining? Quotes like this are supposed to be in their designated place. Who lives on Blueberry Lane? Liara. Do you think playing through the Need for Speed games and doing a video on them would be cool? Let's keep it slow for now. I really don't feel like making a video on Undercover. When are we getting a video on Driver San Francisco? Now that sounds more up my alley. Can you rank all of the Need for Speed titles ever? The Q&A screen is only so big, but Most Wanted, Porsche Unleashed, Heat, Hot Pursuit 2, and Shift 2 would probably be my top 5. Yeah, I'm weird. Need for Speed film review when? It was hard enough making this video on a good game. I'm not spending the time on a bad film. When will you make more videos about racing games? Right now, apparently. Have you ever thought about getting into Nintendo games and hardware? I'm not at all opposed to Nintendo's games. I am very much against their horrible hardware practices. I don't want to just quote this excellent video, so I'll say, due to a PS4 Pro already acting as my dust collector, I've never felt encouraged to pick up a Switch, as it's too likely to just be another unused power drain. What are your thoughts on Halo Reach Firefight? There's fond memories of the excellent DLC map, but aside from that, it isn't a mode I delved into much, mainly because of the appalling connection quality of Halo's online co-op modes back in the day. But even now, there's something about Halo's gameplay that to me never lent itself to holding a position. Obviously, Firefight isn't nearly as cover-based as Gears of War, but I find Halo's at its best when you're making progress through a level. Spartan Ops was a good idea, it was just poorly executed. What anime-ish games have you played or had an interest in? I've had Tales of Berseria in my library for years now, though the one I'm much keener on is Valkyria Chronicles, mainly because of its unique presentation and gameplay, and partly because of its unintentionally hilarious quotes. Why is Judy the best girl in Cyberpunk? I don't know about that. Are you Tony Hawk? No. What is the most valid kink? Tony Hawk. Will you kink shame me? Is your kink Tony Hawk? Fuck you, it's January? Fuck you, it's February. Bitch?